Thank you very much for joining us today. We continue celebrating 25th anniversary of the British Council in Uzbekistan and are working closely with our partners to discuss and explore important themes for education reform nationwide. And we bring together all our partners in Uzbekistan and UK. The theme of our webinar today is around credit transfers and how to make it all work. And I know this is a very exciting and important theme for many universities in Uzbekistan and many higher education stakeholders. So we agreed with the Ministry of Higher and Secondary Specialized Education to have a very focused conversation around how to make academic credit transfer work and how universities can fully benefit from it. Our major partners on this project are, as I said, the Ministry of Higher and Secondary Specialized Education, Yurt Umidi Foundation, all universities in Uzbekistan, and many, many more partners that we're working with, all our stakeholders in reform. So I'm delighted to give a floor to the First Deputy Minister of Higher and Secondary Specialized Education, Kamiljon Karimov, to say a few words and set the context for this discussion. Over to you, Kamiljon.
Thank you, Jamila. Assalamu alaikum, hurmatli webinar ishtirokchilari. Good morning to our colleagues in UK and good afternoon to our colleagues in Uzbekistan. In my very brief welcoming note, I would like first of all to thank our long-standing partner, British Council, for organizing this event once again. I think this is within the ongoing series of the policy dialogues that we have this discussion today. And I would like to use this opportunity also to congratulate our colleagues in British Council with the 25th anniversary of their very successful engagement with Uzbekistan. So, and I also would like to use the opportunity and thank our colleagues in Advanced HE, in particular Professor Alison Jones, who joined us today. Thank you very much, Alison. It's always a pleasure to see you. And I think this is very important that we engage with Advanced HE on this particular topic, because Advanced HE has accumulated the great deal of expertise working throughout the world on different issues around higher education, including this credit transfer systems as well. So thank you very much. We very much appreciate your personal commitment and engagement, Professor Jones. I wish also to thank our colleagues from UK's Quality Assurance Agency, and in particular the Chief Executive Officer, Ms. Stott, who has also very kindly agreed to join us today and also share their expertise in this particular area. I also wish to thank my colleagues from Yurt Umidi who are part of this event today. This is very important, the foundation for Uzbekistan, which also does a lot in terms of the building the capacity of Uzbek young people, sending them outside of Uzbekistan, but also bringing the best international expertise to Uzbekistan. And if you allow me, I would like to continue in Uzbek, addressing to our colleagues in Uzbek universities. Hurmatli hamkasblar, yana bir bor assalomu alaykum. Man barchangizni Oliy va o'rta maxsus ta'lim vazirligi nomidan qutlashga juda ham mamnunman. Va man albatta bugungi kun tartibimizdagi mavzu, ma'luma barchamizga juda muhim mavzu. Mana sizlar juda yaxshi bilasizlar, respublikamizda oliy ta'lim sohasida juda keng qo'llamli islohotlar amalga oshirilyapti. Men o'ylayman, bu ayniqsa oxirgi 5 yilda qilingan ishlar butun respublikamizni rivojini tarixida qoladigan ishlar amalga oshirilyapti. Endi bu oxirgi mana shu 5 yilda qilingan ishlar to'g'risida men o'ylayman gapirish hojati yo'q bu yerda. Biz to'g'risida ko'p sizlar bilan muhokama qilganmiz amalga oshirilayotgan ishlar bo'yicha. Lekin bir narsani aytib o'tish kerak, mana shu oxirgi yillarda qilingan ishlar ko'proq oliy tizimni infrastrukturasini rivojlantirishga qaratilgan va deylik mana shu oliy ta'lim qamrovini ko'paytirishga qaratilgan bo'lsa, va bilamiz bu yerda biz ham juda katta yutuqlarga erishdik desak, menimcha mubolag'a bo'lmaydi. Chunki bor yo'g'i 5 yil ichida qamrovni 3 baravarga oshirish, men o'ylayman bu ham juda kamdan kam davlatlarda qilingan ish. Shuning uchun buni albatta bizni xorijiy hamkorlarimiz ham buni tan oladi va bu ham qandaydir deylik butun xalqaro hamjamiyat tomonidan o'rganadigan bir muhim jihatlarimiz deb aytsak ham bo'ladi. Lekin mana bugungi kunga kelgan shu aynan shu bugungi kundagi bosqichimiz, shu islohotlarning bosqichi ko'proq deylik ta'limni sifatini yaxshilashga qaratilgan. Va bu shu jumladan mana biz bugun sizlar bilan muhokama qiladigan shu kredit modul tizimini takomillashtirishga bag'ishlangan bo'ladi. Va bu borada ham bilasizlar, juda katta ishlar qilinyapti. Mana shu joriy o'quv yilidan barcha oliy ta'lim muassasalarimizda shu kredit modul o'qishni kredit modul tizimi asosida amalga oshirish mana joriy etilgan. Endi albatta bu mana bugun biz shu britaniyalik hamkorlarimiz o'z deylik shu tajribalar bilan o'rtoqlashadi va biz eshitamiz, mana hattoki shu Buyuk Britaniya albatta oliy ta'lim sohasida juda katta deylik yutuqlarga erishgan davlat bo'lishiga qaramay, ularda ham mana shu kredit transfer deydi ular. Mana shu tizimga o'tish u ham albatta oson kechmagan. Va mana bugun bizni hamkasblarimiz bu to'g'risida o'z tajribalari bilan bo'lishadi. Bu albatta uzoq muddatli jarayon va deylik o'ziga yarasha qiyinchiliklarga deylik mana bardosh berishimiz kerak bo'lishi bizga ham ayon. Lekin biz mana bu jarayonga juda katta tayyorgarlik ko'ryapmiz. Bugungi bu o'tayotgan seminar albatta bu bilan cheklanmaymiz. Mana bu yerda yig'ilgan bizni hamkasblar yaxshi biladi. Biz yil davomida juda ko'plab aynan shu kredit modul tizimiga bag'ishlangan ko'plab tadbirlarni o'tkazyapmiz. Bu borada men o'ylayman faqatgina o'quv ishlariga mas'ul bo'lgan deylik bizning o'sha prorektorlarimiz yoki o'quv metodik boshqarmalarimiz emas, balkim barcha oliy ta'lim muassasasidagi ishlayotgan mutasaddilar ushbu tizim bilan tanishish kerak. Shuning uchun biz o'zimizni ishimizni ham mana aynan shu tarzda boshlayapmiz. Biz kredit modul tizimiga bag'ishlangan seminarlarga hattoki bizning shu rektorlarimiz, hurmatli oliy ta'lim muassasalarimiz rektorlarini ham jalb qilib, ularga tegishli bo'lgan, ularga muhim bo'lgan deylik masalalarni shu seminarlarimizda albatta biz ular bilan muhokama qilib olganmiz. Lekin mana bugungi kunda biz shu jarayonni bizning prorektorlarimiz mana o'quv ishlar bo'yicha, o'quv uslubiy ishlar bo'yicha mana mas'ullar bilan, oliy ta'lim muassasalar professor o'qituvchilar bilan ham albatta bu ishni davom ettiryapmiz. Endi men o'ylayman biz mana shu bo'lib o'tgan seminar treninglar davomida kredit modul o'zi nima uchun bizga bu muhim, u deylik o'sha ta'limni deylik sifatini oshirishga qanday ta'sir ko'rsatadi, barcha masalalar albatta sizlar bilan ko'p muhokama qilganmiz va o'ylayman bugun ham aynan shu masalalarga bizni mana hurmatli hamkorlarimiz bu masalaga ham alohida to'xtab o'tishadi. Lekin men shu bugungi seminarga yig'ilgan barcha shu deylik seminar ishtirokchilariga murojaat qilmoqchi edim. Bu endi bu rasmiy bir tadbir emas, bu ishchi bir tadbir. Shuning uchun sizlardan iltimos bo'ladi, o'zingizlarga mana shu ayniqsa kredit modul tizimi bo'yicha qandaydir hali noaniq bo'lgan masalalar bo'lsa, savollar bo'lsa, shu bizning britaniyalik hamkorlarimizga ham bemalol savol berib, o'zinglarni mana qiynayotgan qandaydir masalalar bo'yicha javob olishga sizlarga ham iltimos qilar. Va men o'ylaymanki, mana bu tadbirimiz albatta bizning mana Britaniya kengashi bilan qilayotgan qator tadbirlarimizni bir qismi, bu deylik ishlarimiz davom etadi va men yana bir bor fursatdan foydalanib shaxsan mana Jamila Gulamova va Britaniya kengashimizdagi hamkorlarimizga alohida minnatdorchilik bildirmoqchiman. Yana bir bor e'tiboringlar uchun katta rahmat. Men o'ylayman bugungi seminarimiz juda hammamizga kerakli va muvaffaqiyatli bo'ladi deb o'ylayman. Katta rahmat. Спасибо.
Katta rahmat, Komiljon Hamidovich. Большое спасибо. Big thank you. It's so important that the focus of all universities is now on quality and relevance, and so important that alignment to good international practice is important, and knowledge sharing and learning from experience is very, very topical and important too. And of course, I would like to say that the British Council will continue working with all our higher education partners to unpack major challenges and issues in higher education reform and work together to address them. And we're going to start planning our next series of policy discussions, and that's why all the questions from all participants are really, really important for us. As I mentioned, the other very important partner for us is Yurt Umidi Foundation, and their major focus is on capacity development so that we have people, skilled people who can meet big national economic development ambition. So without further ado, I would like to give a floor to head of Yurt Umidi Foundation, Adhambek Muradov.
Good morning, our friends from UK, our friends from Uzbekistan. It is my great pleasure to participate in this very important webinar today. As Jamila introduced us, Yurt Umidi Foundation deals with sending young specialists to foreign universities to study there. Right now, these days, we have almost more than 370 young people who are studying at leading universities in US, UK, and other well-known universities from Europe and Asia. And it is my pleasure to announce that almost 100 students, they are studying at UK universities. Right now, I am from upstairs where new contest, scholarship contest going on right now. And more of students from master's program and doctorate program, they have chosen to study at UK universities. It is our great pleasure because UK universities, they're well known in education and using information technology in education and so on. Right now, I'm representing here not only Yurt Umidi Foundation, but the Academy of Public Administration under the President of the country. In this regard, I would like to say that our Academy very interesting in establishing long-term cooperation with leading UK universities in implementing credit transfer system in our academy. So that is why using this opportunity, I would like to ask British Council and our UK partners to work with our academy in implementing this very important system in Uzbek universities. So I would like to say that several people, several professors from our academy also joined this webinar today, and I do hope that they will gain lots of information and knowledge through today's presentation. And I would like to say that Yurt Umidi Foundation will continue its very fruitful cooperation with the British Council and other UK universities in terms of preparing young specialists and sending to UK universities and having them back to Uzbekistan, making Uzbekistan more effective and more resultant. Thank you so much for inviting us and having a very interesting event for us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bekmuradov, for your introductory speech, and we're very glad that partnership between UK and Uzbekistan is strengthening, especially in the area of education. And of course, we will continue with you and explore new opportunities to work together. So now thank you. And now I'm delighted to give a floor to the British Council Uzbekistan Country Director, Denise Wadingham, to say a few words and to welcome participants.
Thank you, Jamilia. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good afternoon in Uzbekistan and good morning in the UK. As Kamal John said, it's a very exciting time to be in Uzbekistan with all the reform that's going on in the higher education sector, with a real focus on quality, access and internationalization. And the British Council's Going Global Partnership Programme supports system to system and institutional development collaboration between leading education partners and higher education institutes in Uzbekistan and the UK. I'll add my thanks to the Ministry of Higher and Secondary Specialised Education and the Yurt and Umidi Foundation, also the State Quality of Education Inspection, and all the higher education institutions in Uzbekistan that we're working with for our excellent partnership on this and many other projects and initiatives that the British Council is doing here. This webinar is integral to our policy strand of our higher education project, and it responds to the national higher education reform initiatives to ensure that the higher education sector responds to the needs of the labour market and is aligned to good international standards and practices. As you know, the webinar theme is making academic credit transfer work, and it will discuss how credit transfer systems can be used to support flexible learning routes in higher education, both within a domestic and a global context. So I know you've almost already been introduced, but I'm really delighted today that we have Alison Johnson, Chief Executive of the Advanced HE and formerly the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education with us. It's a real privilege. It's very nice to see you, Alison. And really also extremely pleased to be welcoming Vicky Stott, the Chief Executive Officer at the Quality Assurance Agency in the UK. And I'm really delighted that we have a female lead for the first time at the Quality Assurance Agency. So thanks to everybody. I'm really glad to see there's about 150 people. Maybe we've gone beyond 150 now. So have a very, very good session, everybody. And I will hand back to you, Jamilia. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Denise. And without further ado, over to Alison and Vicky.
Assalamu alaikum. It's very lovely to be joining you all again today and to see so many familiar faces and friends. Can I start by congratulating you, British Council, on your 25th birthday, your 25th anniversary. And it's been my pleasure to work with you for some four years, maybe more now. And the thing I'd like to say is I would like to congratulate Uzbekistan on the changes and the achievements you've made in your higher education system reform. To Kamaljan and to Adkam, thank you for your very warm welcome and your invitations to carry on working with you. It's been a really fascinating journey, and my big congratulations go for the more recent decree, which are giving autonomy to institutions. I think that's such a fantastic achievement. When we first started with you, it was a dream, it was a vision, now it's happened. And I'm mentioning autonomy because it's particularly important for the context of today's discussions and meetings. How can you get an effective credit transfer system in a system which has autonomous institutions? Well, I know that by the end of this session with Vicky, because when we were asked this question, I couldn't think of anybody better than Vicky to come and explain from her experience how we've gone about it. And I wouldn't say that we get it all right, but we've certainly done a lot of learning about it. So I know what Vicky will want to share with you is to try to better understand, how credit modular approaches can work, how we can flex them in the context of developing international partnerships, which I know is really important for you, and how might you go about thinking about designing such a system within an overall quality system, which has a goal of both assurance and enhancement, because they're both really, really important. I think I'm going to stop there because Vicky, I know, has got a fantastic presentation and knowledge and experience to share with you on this. So I'm going to hand the floor to Vicky. And Vicky, I look forward to hearing you as well. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Alison, for that introduction. My colleague Julie is going to share some slides, but I will begin to talk and the slides will come any moment now. So thank you, Alison, and thank you, Minister, and thank you also, Jamilia, for your introductions. And may I also add my congratulations to the British Council. We share a birthday. QAA 2 is 25 this year. It's a real pleasure to join you today for this webinar. It's an exciting time for higher education development in Uzbekistan, and it's great to join you to discuss the possibilities for credit transfer. Our agency, QAA, has a range of partnerships in Uzbekistan already, which we very much value. Alongside the British Council, we've worked productively with the Ministry of Higher and Secondary Specialised Education for many years. We've delivered 5 workshops since 2014, both with the Ministry and with university rectors. And we work closely with our partner agency, IQAA in Kazakhstan, and are developing a trilateral relationship with your new agency, SISQUE. And of course, we've delivered reviews of the University of Westminster and of Amity University, who I know have leading institutions in Tashkent. So as I start out as QAA's new chief executive, I'm looking forward to strengthening those partnerships, working with Alison, Jamilia, and others. For those who don't know QAA, we are the UK's higher education quality body. We're an independent, not-for-profit agency. We were founded in 1997, and we remain the only body recognised to assess the standards and quality of UK universities. We're trusted and recognised by governments in all 4 nations of the UK, and we work in partnership with each of the funders and regulators. It's a complex arrangement, with higher education being operated very slightly differently in each of the 4 UK nations. And the responsibility for regulating universities sits with each nation's respective funding and regulatory body. The Office for Students in England, the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland, the Scottish Funding Council for Scotland, and the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. QAA's role in all of that is to deliver tailored quality approaches for each of these sectors, supported by work across the UK to maintain a coherent system of quality. And some of this work includes conducting independent peer review assessments in all UK nations as the recognised quality body, maintaining the national frameworks and reference points, particularly the UK Quality Code, a key reference point for UK higher education, which underpins all of our assessments. We also offer enhancement opportunities above the thresholds and advice and guidance around effective practice for providers. And we conduct in-country reviews of UK transnational education in partnership with local agencies. So far, QAA has conducted over 45 country reviews of the United Kingdom's transnational education. We're funded by our 290 member institutions, which represent 98% of UK universities. And we have an important role when it comes to credit. Alongside the UK Quality Code, we also maintain the National Higher Education Credit Frameworks. These were first developed in 2001 and published together in 2008, and they've undergone a bit of an evolution since then. The current frameworks are the HE Credit Framework for England, the CQFW for Wales, and the SCQF for Scotland. And we also have the Regulated Qualifications Framework for Northern Ireland and various vocational qualifications. We've done a significant amount of work on the credit framework for England during the pandemic, and we've recently published a revised version, which I'll say a little bit more about later. So, how do we make use of credit? Credit transfer is a really interesting area. It's an area of policy that can make higher education systems flexible and responsive to student need. So it's very welcome to see the commitment from President Mirziyoyev and the government to use credit as part of your programme of education reform. The flexibility of credit systems can support students adapt to changes in their personal circumstances without having to disrupt their education. So as demands increase for a wider range of provision from a wider range of students, it's really important tool to have. In terms of the background in the UK, study for credit has been the norm over the last 20 years. And you can see in this diagram the typical credit for English degrees, with 360 credits making up a bachelor's degree with honours. That's made up of 120 credit qualification chunks, with each credit equivalent to about 10 hours of learning. These degrees are typically single 360 credit qualifications. Credit helps UK providers map their qualifications against agreed frameworks to design their courses. The courses are designed around a combination of aims, and these aims are typically written to describe the content of the course as a whole and for each level. It's about both overarching and more granular learning outcomes. Alison, can you go back a slide, please? Sorry, Julie, can you go back a slide? Thank you. A combination of credit and credit level then recognises the difficulty of learning. It's also a reflection of the notional workload or learning time required to achieve them. But what's important to note here is that not all degree awarding bodies use credits. Within the UK, some do not use credits at all. Some use other models like the European credit transfer system, but credit is used widely enough to provide consistency across the whole of the system across the UK. There is an important balance between the right of higher education providers to be autonomous and the importance of qualifications which are nationally and internationally recognised. But there's increasing diversity in the system. The last few years have been marked by a real shift in how higher education is accessed. It's become much more diverse, with higher degree apprenticeships, fast-track degrees, and much more recognition of prior learning. We've seen more micro-credentials. These at the moment are largely unregulated, small courses designed to meet immediate workforce needs. Sometimes they bear credit, 1, 2, or 5 credits, but often not at all. We've also seen the emergence of big international massive open online course providers, such as Ects, FutureLearn, Coursera, Udacity, and others, offering self-paced online short courses. And we've seen a growing focus on further education colleges and the development of the tertiary sector to suit local needs and demands. We've seen a range of government reviews of post-compulsory education. And so what I'm trying to give you a flavour of is that there are many approaches, but one UK-wide goal of a joined-up, flexible tertiary education. And finally, we've seen the changing world of work. Degrees take investment, not just money, but time and opportunity cost. This isn't always accessible to workers, especially as technology has disrupted the labour market. And that's a trend that's accelerated during the pandemic. The impact of the pandemic has reinvigorated discussions about flexible credit in the UK. The economic impact brought a need to reskill and retrain many workers, as well as to provide students with ways to transfer between vocations. The debate about how higher education should be accessed has intensified. In the UK, government have been clear that they are interested in lifelong flexible learning, including through the proposed lifelong loan entitlement, which is due to come in 2025. There's been a consistent interest from government in recognising more bite-sized chunks of learning, and micro-credentials are just one example of that. Across Europe, too, ministers have acknowledged a need for swift updating of knowledge, skills and competences in the decades to come. That's been reflected through the Rome ministerial communique. Micro-credentials are an important part of this, and a European approach to micro-credentials was published in 2020. There is increasing interest in small, flexible qualifications that have short-term expediency, but also long-term value. This diverse landscape is an opportunity for greater mobility for students, and this is where credit transfer comes in. Typically, the UK's credit transfer system runs through our 8 levels from secondary education through to higher education, with every level consisting of qualifications of comparable difficulty. Although different qualifications within a particular level can cover very different subjects and take different amounts of time to complete. But with this greater flexibility, there is interest in breaking the modules up further. Students can use the flexibility to pick up different chunks of learning at different times. They can accumulate credit over longer periods, taking pauses to return to study later, as this diagram shows, and moving between providers and courses. This flexibility can help reduce dropout rates, boost access to higher education, and offer students greater choice. Long term, it can improve life chances and social mobility of underrepresented groups. The flexibility provided can allow students to mix between vocational, work-based and academic programs, which can result in better career decisions. It's therefore beneficial to employers as well. More people can be encouraged to develop the skills needed in the labour market. Targeted opportunities can help fill gaps quickly, and potential employees without standard full qualifications can still demonstrate the level of learning that they've achieved. Providers can work with employers to formally accredit in-company learning. So there's a whole range of benefits. This fan-shaped diagram is our credit framework, and I've mentioned that we've revised it recently. The new framework is designed to support this flexibility. Effectively, the credit framework is a shared base code that providers can choose to use to develop their provision. And it's built around 4 principles: clarity, consistency, flexibility, and creativity. Clarity is about providing a clear structural basis for providers to use to develop flexible courses. They can be transparent for students, and they can be open about the difficulty involved in each course. Consistency is about providing fairness in workloads across the range of courses. It helps to promote a common language for students and for academics to discuss curriculum development. And flexibility is about developing partnerships and mobility. The framework is aligned with international standards. The UK framework relates to the overarching qualifications framework in Europe, the EQF, and the FQEHEA or Bologna framework. Bologna identifies the level of credits for qualifications in the European credit transfer system. And in turn, the European credit transfer system maps against the Asian credit transfer system, ACTS. So you can see how there is a clear comparison between the UK and the ECTS. For example, a bachelor's degree with honours in England, Wales and Northern Ireland has a typical credit volume of at least 360 credits. This typically equates to 180 ECTS, European Credit Transfer System credits, as long as the learning outcomes are consistent. So it's about combining credits with course design. A master's degree with 180 credits equates to 90 ECTS credits. The ECTS is widely used in the UK, and indeed its use has grown over the last 20 years. It's used alongside the UK credit frameworks in a complementary way. The main advantage to this alignment is supporting international student mobility. I know this is an important priority for Uzbekistan, and so I would certainly recommend considering alignment with the European credit transfer system. And finally, creativity is about encouraging providers to create innovative and flexible courses. And the really important feature of the UK system here is the high degree of institutional autonomy, which I mentioned earlier. And I know your country has shifted its approach on institutional autonomy recently with new decrees to encourage more independence and development. So it's worth looking at the advantages and disadvantages of a high autonomy system when it comes to credit. Can we move to the next slide, please, Julie? So in the wider quality assurance system, our credit frameworks in the UK recognise higher education providers' autonomy and their independence. The framework encourages them to make the most effective use of credit in the context of their own mission and values. It's not a regulatory tool. And because of this, it allows providers the freedom to adopt and adapt elements of it as appropriate to their needs and their circumstances. This is part of the wider culture of the quality system in the UK, which encourages creativity and difference to flourish. If you imagine academic quality exists on a spectrum, it might range from quality control through quality assurance and into quality enhancement. So quality control is a straightforward system of testing performance against benchmarks, and that's around providing accountability to governments and to regulators and checking that universities provide consistent outcomes. Quality assurance, on the other hand, is about providing confidence in the system. There might be less external oversight of the outcomes, but typically universities will use assurance techniques themselves to hold themselves responsible for the processes underpinning their outcomes. They need to systematically monitor and evaluate their learning and teaching to ensure that it has the outcomes that they specified at the beginning. Quality enhancement then goes further, and that's about developing a process of continuous improvement. It's a habitual life cycle of innovating to make the student learning experience better. In the UK, quality is managed through the confidence of assurance, the measurement of control, and the systematic improvement of enhancement. But underpinning all of this is the framework of standards to measure against. And it's that shared set of standards that makes the model work. And the credit framework is one of these. It's absolutely key to that system. Our standards are what we call key sector reference points, and they revolve around the UK Quality Code. They include the Quality Code itself, the credit framework, the qualifications frameworks, and supporting standards like QAA's subject benchmark statements. Our quality code is also mapped against international standards, the European standards and guidelines, for example. So together, these set the basic expectations for students. But it's then up to higher education providers to interpret and to define in their own context how these apply to them. There is flexibility and there is opportunity for innovation and creativity. In many ways, this flexibility has helped us develop our credit transfer systems. The high level of respect for institutional autonomy has been fundamental to securing cooperation. The national credit arrangements are owned jointly by the sector. They are permissive rather than prescriptive. In agreeing to join the credit frameworks, universities are clear that they do not have to accept other people's credit. Each university ultimately retains control of its own decisions around credit. This has ensured that there is wide support and engagement with the framework, and so it's a positive feature of a high autonomy system. But there are challenges too. There is a lot of competition around reputation in the UK. I know that Dr. Andrew Turner from Coventry University spoke to many of you last May about the role of league tables. When universities are competing in reputational terms, then building that inter-institutional trust can be difficult. And this means that they can be reluctant to recognise learning and credits awarded elsewhere by their competitors. We're seeing very similar problems developing in the new continental credit transfer system in Africa, for example. That system, as written in the 2014 Addis Convention, sets out clear requirements for mutual recognition. But in practice, there have been issues with approvals for students transferring from universities which are low in the league tables. Similarly, autonomy can mean the jigsaw pieces of learning don't quite match. Institutions are largely free to develop their own curriculum, built around meeting specific learning objectives. This means there's a high degree of variation in course content between institutions, and that can make it difficult for students to transfer from one university to another. Students transferring courses might not have covered the same content deemed necessary to pass the new course. And there can also be different kinds of compromises made within credit-based assessment regulations. So while the frameworks are universally adopted, the way they're implemented can vary widely. Another challenge is when national regulations disincentivize flexible learning. This doesn't seem like a problem for Uzbekistan because the impression I get is very much that there's strong alignment between government strategy and the direction for the sector. But a challenge we found in England in particular is that the current regulatory metrics reward continuation, retention, and completion. And this creates a regulatory disincentive to provide short, flexible higher education programs in a system that students can leave and rejoin. It will be important for your country to develop joined up systems that align regulation, funding, and quality assurance. Ideally, it's helpful to develop a sector-wide system to track credit, like digital passports. What all of this means is that it's critical for institutions to work together. There has to be strong collaboration and trust. This often works well at a localized level. Partnerships of institutions can work together to match their provision to local skills, needs, and demands. In the UK, we've seen regional credit consortia become established, such as the Midlands Credit Compass or NUCAT and Chic. There is potential for flexible learning to be transformative for regions which have struggled economically. But partnerships also work internationally, of course. And some of the best examples of this collaboration are in the partnerships that exist between UK institutions and international providers. I know that Dr. Turner spoke last May about international credit recognition, and Coventry is amongst some really good examples of articulation agreements. Universities can set up partnership agreements with international institutions which recognise credit. Students studying at these partners will often pick up modules of learning on designated courses which are comparable to modules at UK university. This means they're able to transfer easily. They can get onto streamlined courses with exemptions from duplicate modules, and this means they can access dual awards. Similarly, top-up courses can convert qualifications below degree level to degrees. We often see foundation degrees in the UK, which are designed with these top-up routes in mind to facilitate progression. This flexibility of approach lets students study locally and then transfer later to complete their degree. Validation partnerships mean that students may not even have to travel. When they're designed effectively, these top-up arrangements feel coherent to the student. Both of these routes open up opportunities for students from a wide range of backgrounds. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to choose institutions that they are overqualified for. Greater credit transfer opportunities means that they can switch to a different institution at the end of the first or second year and significantly improve their life chances. There is some evidence of this in the US, where easy transfer for vulnerable students from community colleges to universities has demonstrated social mobility. There was a paper published on this by Jenkins and Fink in 2015. The international mobility that can be fostered brings benefit not just for students, but also for nations. Students enter into an international education arena where national credit frameworks are a passport to mobility. It also means that skilled workers with recognized professional competencies can travel to fill the areas of greatest need internationally. The best way to develop these partnerships is through alignment with international standards and frameworks. When your credit system is mapped globally, it provides a level of confidence and transparency which enables collaborative working internationally. There are other ways to build this international confidence too, and I know that the Ministry is seeking to expand cooperation in education, for example, through your discussions with Kazakhstan about building a Central Asian unified higher education area. For us at QAA, we support international capacity building through our International Quality Review method. IQR helps institutions to build a global reputation by providing accreditation against internationally recognized standards in quality. It's about forming long-lasting partnerships with UK institutions, driving improvement and strengthening global positioning. Establishing trust in partner institution standards is important to make credit transfer work. Institutions need to feel confident that transferring students will not endanger their own reputation. And equally, it's important to provide confidence for students and for quality bodies. In addition to student transfers, international partnerships can deliver strong transnational education provision. Where providers have confidence in a shared system of standards and quality, then collaborative provision can develop. And that's made even easier where there are mutually recognized credit systems. TNE is extremely important to the UK. In the UK International Education Strategy, our government has explicitly expressed interest in supporting transnational education as a key growth area. We see it as a significant part of internationalization, development, and globalization in a connected world. It helps support development agendas and cross-cultural understanding and collaboration, and it also brings economic value to both host and sending countries. The appetite for UK degrees abroad is already substantial. 4 out of 5 universities offer overseas higher education programs in 225 locations worldwide, delivering UK higher education to over 690,000 students. The impact of COVID-19 encouraged UK providers to expand their TNE. A lot of that trust is about establishing strong quality systems that continually review their performance. And when you develop credit transfer systems, it's important that you constantly measure their success. This goes deeper than just measuring the number of providers or students engaging with the system. For example, you can track the impact on student transitions and retention through the comparison of dropout rates. But as we've seen from the UK example, those systems have to be underpinned by shared standards. So how do we approach quality assurance? At QAA, we've looked to international partners. In Europe, ENQA are engaged in the MicroBol project, using tools under the Bologna process to explore guaranteeing quality for micro-credentials. The project is due to complete later this year, and I think it will bring really interesting lessons for the post-pandemic era. In Australia, the National Qualifications Framework was reviewed in 2019, with recommendations to adapt it for the future, including short credit-bearing qualifications. This is part of a global trend. I know that the ministry has good relationships with Turkey, and they underwent significant strengthening of their national vocational qualification system and qualifications framework between 2015 and 2017. In New Zealand, there's been a regulatory effort to create coherent transferable credits. They have a legal requirement for all micro-credentials to be recorded with the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. And the European Commission project has developed a proposed EU standard, which would record key information, including aims and learning outcomes. So there are plenty of different approaches, each dependent on the level of autonomy offered to providers. So to pull everything together and to look ahead, I want to emphasize that the key to all of this is robust quality assurance processes which generate confidence. Higher education providers need to understand what is expected of them and what to expect from each other. This means commitment to a shared set of standards which underpin the system. There may be guiding permissive principles, as in our credit framework, or they may be legally enforced, like the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. But either way, providers need to develop relationships of reciprocal trust. We've seen examples of this flexibility and collaboration during the pandemic. There was an extraordinary level of cooperation, especially during the initial move to online learning. And as we look ahead, providers need to continue to work together, establishing partnerships, establishing regional consortia, and establishing communities of practice. This is particularly important for autonomous providers. But it's also important to have qualifications which are agile, which are local, and which are short, especially in post-pandemic recovery. But they need to hold on to their value over time, and they need to be easily transferable into a bigger system if that's what the students require. None of these things are easy, but in doing them, it's possible to build a system which is genuinely transformative. Students can have flexibility to study in a way that works for them. If the system is robust, flexible, and transparent, then it can value learning undertaken in a variety of contexts or at different periods of time. The system can allow students to interrupt and resume their studies while maintaining an up-to-date and verified record of achievements. They can re-engage later in life, and they continue to achieve a full qualification. They can tailor their own progress to suit their circumstances. They can choose to move seamlessly between periods of study at different stages in their learning or educational career and their wider life course. They can travel internationally and fill important workforce gaps. They can have a better student experience with more ownership of their own learning and flexibility around their study and life balance. Flexible provision should not be seen as a replacement for traditional degree models, but as an alternative. Choice and agency for students is important, both in terms of what they learn, where they learn, and how they learn it. They should complement existing degrees and carry lasting value so that they are lifelong and transferable. and each part can build into a larger whole, tailored for every individual learner. The possibilities here depend on how adaptable the higher education sector is. There needs to be close collaboration and agreement between providers and strategic long-term investment from government usually to make it work. At QAA, we're supporting some projects to explore the potential opportunities. These include a collaborative enhancement product on modular learning led by Bath College and involving partners including Coventry University, Bath Spa, the University of Middlesex and Staffordshire University. This is a really exciting area and one which has the potential to change the way that we do higher education. It can make education more accessible to more people, aiding development and boosting employment. There was a working paper from UNESCO in 2020 which suggested that internationally, flexible learning pathways are not yet a national priority for higher education. It said they were lacking targeted measures to facilitate their implementation. And that's why forums like this today are essential to share experiences and learn from each other. It's an exciting moment for the future of higher education in Uzbekistan. So I hope you found this helpful. And as we look ahead, let's keep collaborating with our partners and sharing what we learn. Thank you. Alison, back to you.
Thank you very much. That was a real tour de force, Vicky, and a lot to consider. But you can see the prizes to be won, can't you, in terms of that flexibility and that recognition. I think I'm going to stop speaking now. I'd like to hand back to Jamilia, because I think, Jamilia, you'll be managing the question and answer session, I believe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Vicky. It's really, really interesting. And actually, the more we talk about credit transfer, the more questions we have got. And I'm managing several kind of conversations through different channels with participants. So there are a few questions around credit, around micro-credentials. And people ask to explain what this means and what is the starting point for a university to start discussions around micro-credentials, and also how micro-credentials can lead to dual award degrees, for example.
That's a really interesting question, Jamilia, and I'll start it with a slight warning that it becomes easy quite quickly to overcomplicate this issue. But I think at its most simple, micro-credentials are short blocks of credit, and the real beauty of them is that they can be designed through partnerships with employers and local economic bodies and learning providers, universities, so that they're very targeted to a very specific local need. And what that does is it allows people who need to upskill or retrain, or who are training for the first time but don't want to engage in a full-length degree. It allows those kinds of students to have learning that is relevant to their employment needs or the needs of their local economy. And that learning is immediately applicable and useful. It's designed specifically to provide learning outcomes that meet the requirements of the local economy. What's important from a credit transfer point of view is that those often quite brief courses are assigned a credit value, and to do that they need to have clear learning outcomes and clear metrics for the amount of learning time and the experience of learning that's contained within them. And once that's been established, you can assign credit against your credit framework. And those little blocks of credit can be added to later. So provided you've got the correct quality assurance processes in place and you can see that the learning outcomes met local standards, you can see that they are correctly assessed and therefore the student's learning is embedded and the student has been enriched and transformed by the experience of the micro-credential, And then, I don't know, say 3, 4, 5 years later, the student wants to retrain or to gain a promotion or to change their discipline entirely. Who knows? Life has happened. And this student wants to come back to education, and they can go to a university over here and say, I've got 15, 20 credits that I learned in this university over here 5 years ago, and I wish to transfer them into a larger course. I wish to build those up into a degree. And this university can assess those credits against its own requirements for entrance. And so there is complete autonomy. The university that designed the course had the autonomy to work locally with its partners. It designed its course. There was no central curriculum. There was no kind of overarching requirement. That was a local piece of work. This university over here also has autonomy. It can specify its own entrance requirements. But because the student has learned and is assessed against a credit framework, the new university can see what they know, and it can grant an equivalence in its own learning structures for the learning that has already happened elsewhere. So that's how it's flexible over time. And then you also asked how that can build up from a foundation degree into a full degree. And that looks more like, I suppose, a period of learning that isn't necessarily broken up over the course of a lifetime. So a foundation degree is very useful for ensuring parity at the point of entrance into a full degree. You might take students from all kinds of backgrounds. You might take students from different countries. You might take students from different learning systems. And in the foundation degree, you have a mechanism by which you design a course with appropriate modules and learning outcomes and assessments that are all framed within your own particular quality and standards framework. You put the students through that course, they undertake the assessments, they demonstrate their learning, and at that point, all those diverse students from all those different backgrounds and systems are assessed to be at parity. They can move into the degree. And it may well be that the design of your foundation course is such that the students who've completed it are beyond perhaps the first year of the degree in the university they're moving to and can articulate straight into the second year. So their degree experience becomes compressed rather than elongated over the course of their lifetime. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vicky. Yes, it is. And a few more questions in the chat. So how do you hold the university accountable in the UK in the context of academic and financial autonomy of universities?
It's a really good question. And the answer is there are slightly different systems across each of the nations of the UK. The thing that we have in common is the UK Quality Code. And the UK Quality Code sets a series of expectations for quality and standards. And those expectations are subscribed to by all universities and higher education providers in each of the nations across the UK. There are what's called core practices, and the core practices form a kind of regulatory baseline, if you like. And then there are common practices, and those common practices form the basis for enhancement, for continually improving the quality of provision. And I see that Julie has put a link to the quality code in the chat, which is very helpful. Thank you, Julie. So across all of the nations of the UK, regulators assess against the baseline of the quality code, the core practices. And in England, that's it. So any university that is demonstrated to have met the threshold standards of the core practices of the quality code is regulatorily okay, as long as the regulator is happy that it's met those core practices. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they do more than simply a quality control, quality assurance exercise. They move into the space of quality enhancement, and they ask providers what they're doing continually to improve their practices. So if you like, in England, there's a sense that improvement from the regulatory point of view, improvement only needs to happen if it must happen. In the other nations, there's a sense of the regulator expects you to notice when improvement could happen and to act on that, so that you are continually having some sort of transformative effect on the nature of your provision, but also importantly on the nature of your students. In England, the regulatory baseline, as I've suggested, is lower, but universities nonetheless subscribe voluntarily to the enhancement practices of the Quality Code. And so there is a very lively community of practice, or several community of practices, that coalesce around different mission groups. So although universities are highly autonomous and their funding follows their student intake, so students pay through a loan which is given to them by the government, so it is still government funding, but each block of funding follows an individual student. So despite those levels of autonomy, both institutionally and financially, universities do coalesce around similar missions and their achievements and their aims and aspirations. And between those mission groups, there are communities of practice which work to develop enhancement in quality and standards across those missions of practice. And this is all made transparent through things like league tables and reports on various pieces of work and bits of guidance that universities in England choose to share their practice with us. And we publish guidance that highlights good practice around the sector and thinks about how that can be extended out more widely. So it's a system of voluntary enhancement that is motivated by providers who are entirely autonomous, but who are always motivated, A, to maintain their reputation, B, to maintain their competitive advantage, and C, to actually genuinely push forward the boundaries of education and knowledge.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And probably related to that, you mentioned quality assurance, but you also talk about quality enhancement. So can you comment on both terms that you are using and maybe unpack the difference?
Oh, that's a big question, Jamelia. So quality assurance, I think, is really the process that an institution uses to reassure itself that it can continuously provide the outcomes that it represents to students that it will provide. So, and those outcomes will be described in the course content, they'll be described in the learning outcomes for courses, and they'll be described in the processes for assessment. But they'll also be described in the provider's mission statement, its strategy, its vision. And they will also have to satisfy the requirements of regulatory bodies in professional practice, so medical bodies, legal bodies, that sort of thing. So from a quality assurance point of view, a provider will need to have a set of processes and policies and systems that it implements in order to deliver those outcomes. And it will need to continually have an eye on whether those processes and policies and systems are working. So in fact, whether the outcomes are being delivered. So I would suggest that quality control is a retrospective measure of whether the outcomes have met the specification. But if you wait until the quality control point without anything from the point of enrollment to the point of graduation that is ensuring that everything that works in the system is working correctly, then those outcomes are a matter of luck. So assurance is your internal mechanism for looking at your policies, practices and processes and making sure that they are leading in the right direction to provide the outcomes. That's quite mechanical, it's quite utilitarian, and it's thinking very much about things like fitness for purpose and meeting specifications and delivering what people expect. And those are all important things. I'm not suggesting for a moment that anybody should take their eye off any of those things. But actually, university education is about more than that, isn't it? We're not here simply to deliver an expected outcome. And although we can provide consistent opportunities of experience to all students, we can't guarantee how each individual student will benefit from those opportunities and those experiences, because each student is an individual. And really, I think the point of education is transformative. As a student, when you start out on your journey, when you first leave compulsory education and move into higher education, for example, you're not entirely sure what you want. It's a transformative journey with an unknown destination. You can't say at that point where you want to be at the end of it, because what you're hoping for the most part is that something will happen in the meantime which makes your understanding more sophisticated, and your journey will not be a straight line. So in that sense, it would be really difficult to meet the expectations of the student. How would you do that? You're hoping to transform that individual. And in that process of providing a student education, you would also hope that that conveys benefit to the lecturers involved, to the teachers. Education is mutually transformative. It's a co-creative act. You collaborate to establish this learning. And so quality enhancement is really about looking at that transformative element of education. It's about taking an experience and making it better. It's about thinking about how that transformation can grow, how it influences the participants in it, and how it produces better and better results for the student, for the institution, and for society. That's much harder to measure. It's much harder to put metrics around. And we've seen through various different political imperatives, policy imperatives, governments, funding regulations, and so on. We've seen different attempts to measure that transformative process. And none of them is entirely satisfactory, because it is a very nebulous concept, whereas assurance is much easier. You can go and look at somebody's policies, you can look at their processes, you can compare them to outcomes, and you can make a judgment about whether they're working. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And now back to credit transfer. And I have got a few questions, and one of them is credit transfer an arrangement by concrete universities, or is it something else?
Is it an arrangement by, sorry, I missed, by what universities?
By concrete universities.
Yeah. The simple answer is yes, it is. And this is one of the areas where it would be very easy to overcomplicate the system. So we've had a very lively debate about micro-credentials between our members very recently, because they're such a new product, and because the idea of flexibly accreting them and accumulating them is growing in popularity in the UK. And one of the debates around micro-credentials, excuse me, is how you transfer the credit from one system to another, whether you need to have a rigorous set of external rules that work across the system to enable credit to transfer from one provider to another provider. But within all UK providers, there are already a number of factors which allow for or don't allow for credit transfer, depending on the provider. One of the most simple ways that credit transfer is ruled in or ruled out is simply capacity. So each provider has a capacity. This is a simple concept. I don't think I'm about to introduce anything novel to anybody listening to this talk today. You have so much physical space, you have so many academic staff, you can only produce so many students into that space and give them a good quality experience. Once you're full, you are depleting the experience of all your existing students and all your new students if you take any further students. So that's a very simple equation. Have I got space? The other is this new applicant qualified to come and participate in my courses? Will they enrich the learning experience of the students who are already there and the academics who are teaching them? And will we enrich them? And that's very important. And within an autonomous institution in the UK, each provider has their own separate set of rules. We call it recognition of prior learning, and they have their own internal processes that say what kind of prior learning they will accept at which points of entry and at which level of learning. And that's completely a discrete matter for discrete universities to decide for themselves. And so within the capacity that they have available, they are entirely empowered to make their own decisions about admission and about the value of credit that's being brought to them. Now, it might be that, for example, a student studies 120 credits, a whole year of a higher education degree at a local small university, and it wishes to transfer those credits into the second year of a degree at a bigger, more distant university. The bigger, more distant university might say, okay, that's absolutely fine. You can come into our second year. Or they might look at the specification of the modules that the student studied at its first university and the learning outcomes from those modules and say they don't quite match with what you would have done if you'd been here. And therefore, we will not give you credit for the full year, even though you have 120 credits. We will give you credit for, say, 90 of the credits that we would have offered you in that first year. And you must study again for an additional 30 credits to ensure that you meet our progression requirements into the next year of the degree that we provide. And that is completely their choice. They have that autonomy, they have that authority. Or they might say, you did your 120 credits over here, and they exactly map to the 120 credits that we would offer, but you did them 10 years ago, and pedagogy has moved on, the discipline has moved on, and therefore we require you to do an additional however many credits to bring your knowledge and skills up to date so that you don't fall behind the development of knowledge in the next year of our degree. And that again is entirely their decision, and they have complete autonomy to do it. The only thing we ask is that they make it transparent to all applicants at the point of application what their policy is and how they will apply it.
Thank you, Vicky. And next question, which is again about credit transfers, and this time it's around how to combine credits with course design. So what's the process? Is there any guidance for universities?
Yes, there is some guidance. And again, it's up to the universities how they put the guidance together. So at a course design level, we produce something called a subject benchmark statement. And the subject benchmark statements are produced by the sector. So what we do is, and I suppose it's probably fair to say at the beginning that once they've been produced, they're then reviewed every 5 to 7 years. So they never stagnate. And what we do is we put out a call for subject experts in cognate disciplines. So at the moment, for example, we're reviewing 14 of the subject benchmark statements this year. We've put out a call for senior academic colleagues from across the sector to apply to chair a subject benchmark statement review group. And we've put out calls for other academic colleagues to join that review group. And we try to ensure that each review group comprises senior and junior academics with good standing from as wide a range of providers as we can. And we also, where it's relevant, try to ensure that we have representation from professional and regulatory bodies who require the degree to meet their fitness for practice standards. And those review groups will look at what are the core disciplines that must be studied that in essence make a degree in that subject be valid. So the subject benchmark statement sets the minimum kind of level of expectation of content for a subject. That's then combined with the credit framework, which talks about contact hours and the immersion in learning that a student should expect to undertake in order to earn the credits. And it's combined with each provider, when they're designing courses, will write a course specification which sets out what the module would look like, what disciplines it will cover, what learning outcomes the student would expect to achieve, and how those learning outcomes will be assessed. And so the subject benchmark statements, the learning outcomes, the course specification, and the credit framework all combine together to help design courses. And those courses are then measured, of course, against the framework for higher education qualifications to ensure that they come together in the right way, that people are studying the right amount of credit, the right volume of credit to gain a qualification at a particular level within that framework. So it's a complex interrelation of different frameworks and pieces of guidance that allows universities to understand what they need to do at the minimum to design courses. But then they can choose to exceed that. They can be creative about how they apply that guidance. They can develop the subjects and develop the knowledge. They can dictate how much is research-based and how much is taught, how much is discursive, how much is individual private study, and so on and so forth. Those sorts of things are for the individual provider to satisfy their own pedagogical strategy and to design for themselves. I think that about covers it. It is a complex interrelation, and there are a lot of moving parts that have to play together, but it really is. It creates a huge amount of autonomy for providers to be able to design their own courses and their own kind of assessment methods.
Thanks, Vicky. And just moving to the next question, which is very related to what you have just said, but maybe we need a general kind of advice from you around how to make sure that credit transfer in Uzbekistan is recognized by other countries. Maybe some general kind of tips and
yes, yeah.
advice.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question because that's the thing that allows mobility of your students and allows other students to come and confidently study at your universities. So I see completely that's a really good question. I think for me, the key way to achieve that kind of mobility and transferability is to ensure that your credit framework is aligned to an international credit framework, that there is a very clear mapping that people can see, either to the European credit transfer system or to the Asian credit transfer system. I mean, in a sense, it doesn't really matter which of the international credit systems you map to, provided that mapping is agreed amongst the sector and is very clear. And once you have that mapping, as I discussed earlier in my presentation, then it makes it very easy for international providers to see what your students have studied and how it's equivalent to their own particular system. And it makes credit transfer very much easier. And in a nutshell, really, that is as simple as it is. It's making sure that you have that alignment and mapping and that your providers understand it and that it is clear and easy for your students to understand as well.
Thanks, Vicky. In your presentation, you mentioned that one of the advantages of credit transfer is that it allows for people, say, with disabilities to have access to higher education opportunities. Can you give some examples so that our universities know what's involved and how to make it possible?
Yeah, I mean, this really applies not just to people with disabilities, but people who might have caring responsibilities or, who might need temporarily to leave university and join the world of employment or whatever. So really, there's a sort of combination of things. It became clear during the pandemic in the UK that studying online, having the ability to study virtually, made the world of education much more flexible and accessible to particular subgroups of students. And those subgroups of students were students who, for economic reasons, had to work alongside their study, students who had caring responsibilities, which meant that they couldn't reliably commit to being physically present on a university campus between the hours that they were required to for study, students who had physical or other impairments that meant that they, again, couldn't reliably be where they needed to be to participate in study, and so on. So the flexibility of online provision opened up the world of access to education for a lot of people. Nonetheless, if online provision or some kind of hybrid provision of pedagogy is the only adjustment that you make for different communities, then the underlying assumption would still, it seems to me, be that everybody can study for their discipline in a single block of time, 1 year after another after another. And again, we know that that's not always true. Things happen, life happens to people, and sometimes study needs to be interrupted. So with a credit transfer system, or with a system of credits that's recognized across your entire university provision, that allows people to interrupt their studies, provided that they have demonstrated, or they can demonstrate that they have met the learning outcomes of the credit that they signed up for originally. They can then interrupt and come back to their studies at a later time. And you can see this a great deal in the US system. So in the US system, it's entirely possible for a student to study 1 year and then go and work for 4 or 5 years while they accumulate sufficient funding to return to study. When they come back to study, they can say, well, I got 1 year of credit from the University of San Francisco, say, and for a start, that credit has been recognized in their employment. It has stood them in good stead for seniority and access to employment. And then for another thing, they can go and say, I've got this year of credit, and they can be taken into the second year of either their original university or another university. And that really, I think, is the strength of a credit system, that it really allows students, and I guess providers too, to tailor the system that works best for their particular needs or their particular community. It means you can have providers who say, we want to serve this particular community of students. We want to serve students who are in full-time employment. We have that in the UK through the Open University, who for many years now have serviced students on a part-time basis, offering them really high quality education at a point where they're able to access it, and students can dip in and out of that education in a way that enables them to lead rich and fulfilling lives and to accommodate their own needs in the way that best suits them. So it really is about giving students the very best choices for their particular needs, rather than assuming that there is any one size fits all provision.
Thanks, Vicky. This is really important, and it's important for Uzbekistan universities to become more inclusive. Mm-hmm. So any advice and case studies are really useful.
Yeah.
So here is a question from Samarkand, and that is around credit transfer and academic mobility of staff. So what are the opportunities under credit transfer umbrella for academic staff to become more mobile?
Okay, that's interesting. I'm not sure that credit transfer has an enormous amount of influence on the mobility of academic staff, but I will wait for one of my colleagues to correct me in my chat. But I think for academic staff, I mean, I guess being able to demonstrate their qualifications and their research and learning in the same system that students are is good for being able to kind of establish their bona fides and credentials in the same way that they can elsewhere. And again, if you have people who've been educated in a system with a clearly mapped credit transfer system, then that will facilitate international mobility for everybody who's been through that system at every point of their future life. So from that point of view, for academic staff, it's really helpful. I guess if you're looking at staff mobility, at academic mobility, the fact that you have a cohort of academics who are used to operating within a credit system, who understand the importance of credit and the flexibility of credit, then that too will open up employment opportunities. I think there are, there are a wide number of really highly developed education systems internationally which employ credit systems, and as I say, familiarity with those will be very useful for staff mobility. But I think as a sort of direct, from one provider to another, I think that's more about kind of traditional employment opportunities than it is about credit. Of course, the academic excellence of teaching staff is really Alison's speciality. So maybe I should at this point hand over to Alison and see if she has anything she wants to add on this point.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I've just sent Jamilia a small message, which is, I think, whilst credit transfer systems have not really been designed for the benefits of academics, they really do sort of focus on the student and the outcomes. These academics, of course, will be used to designing and delivering their pedagogical experience for the students to a standard which is internationally recognised. So therefore, that gives them the experience and the skill set and the standing to operate in different environments because they understand what the equivalencies are. And I also think from an enhancement and the development of teaching and learning, the Advanced HE teaching fellowships as well, it would enable them to really engage with becoming a teaching fellow through that reflective programme, because they are used to working at internationally recognised standards. So I think it's one of the additional benefits, maybe one of the unintended benefits of a credit transfer system, that it gives people, they are required to work to different standards. Whilst I've got the talking stick, as we say in our household, something that I wanted to just reflect on with you, and also Vicky, take your thoughts on this. I think you mentioned something really important, which relates to designing of a credit transfer system in country, is to decide really what's the important purpose of this. Because what we see, particularly in England, are tensions within some of the policy purposes. And you mentioned the importance in terms of regulatory demands in England of continuation, continuing from one level of education to another, retention whilst you're in higher education, completion. And our universities, through our regulatory body, have expectations to deliver on that. And then on the other hand, we want a credit transfer system which provides a flexible skills-based workforce who can drop in and out. So I think for policymakers, when you're thinking about this, it's really important to think about what is your priority, what's your purpose, how policies might conflict, and or how at the very least they'll interact with each other, and how they may help or hinder you achieving your ultimate goals here. So that's something that you provoked in my thinking, because I was reading about our new policy, potential policy about a lifelong learning in 2025. And sorry, someone's just tried to call me. I've just got rid of them. So, which is providing a lifelong learning entitlement, as it says, of a certain amount of value over a period of time, which would very much support this credit transfer way of learning. I just wonder what your reflections are, Vicky, on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the policy environment is absolutely key, really, and as you say, that they can be in conflict. So the current requirement for progression does make it very difficult to build in that flexibility. And if you I think one of the unforeseen consequences of that is that we're currently seeing legislation that will empower that idea of continuation through to completion, but then by definition will mean that there needs to be further legislation to get to the point where we can have that flexibility of provision that allows take up of the lifelong learning. And while that's not a problem in itself, what it does mean is that there is no kind of long-term stability of environment for providers, for universities to be able to think about, well, I can design this course and I can sit back and watch it evolve and develop the boundaries of knowledge over a period of time. So it's not necessarily just about the metrics, it's about from the ground up, how much security are you providing within your environment for universities to develop, to mature, to push the boundaries of their pedagogy and so on. Any kind of metrics that you've got should also be sufficiently flexible to adjust. So those sorts of metrics that look at progression and completion, we can't just tweak them. We can't make little incremental changes to make them more kind of permissive of a more flexible provision. So again, that's something that when you're designing a system needs to be borne in mind. How future-proof is this system? Are you setting in train a series of actions or an environment that will require training within the foreseeable, will require changing in the foreseeable future? And is that what you want to do? Is that the best thing for your system?
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Vicky. And there is a question in the chat around course completion policies for graduates or graduating students under credit transfer, and and they ask specifically whether any research work is required for bachelor's or master's programs.
Another really good question, and the really simple answer is it depends on the course, and it depends on each university's strategy, and you tend to find that there are different answers between different courses within the same university, never mind between universities. This is one of the beauties of a truly autonomous system, that there is no rigorous requirement for how credits are delivered. There is a rigorous requirement for what volume of credit needs to be studied to achieve a level of qualification, but how those credits are delivered, whether they're delivered through teaching or whether they're delivered through research projects, is not stipulated. What I would say is that it's quite common in a bachelor's degree, it's quite common for there to be a sort of capstone piece of research, a long project or a long essay in the form of a thesis of some sort. That's not uncommon. And usually that kind of capstone piece would carry a greater credit load than a straightforward module. So you might find that the modules of a course are set at around 30 credits, but the capstone dissertation or thesis is set at, say, 60 credits. So that's quite common, but it's not enforced. It's not compulsory. There is no kind of policy or regulation around that. It's entirely for the course design. I would say really that the only thing that is really important is that it's stipulated in the I'm sorry, I've completely lost the word, which doesn't help. But in the description of the course, when students are signing up for it, it needs to be very clear what their choices are so that they can plan their study and make sure that they're doing the thing that they need to do. But there is no overall policy. And the same for a master's degree. Slightly complicated by a master's degree. Because they tend to split. So you tend to have either masters by research or taught masters by teaching, and so in that sense it's often clearer within a provider which you're going to do, but not always. Even within a taught masters, there is again often this capstone piece of a larger volume of credit, a single dissertational thesis with a larger amount of credit attached to it, which would complete the year of taught, so that you can really assess that the student has engaged and developed their understanding and thought about the learning.
Thank you very much. And I have got 3 more questions, probably for both of you to answer them quite quickly because we have to finish in maybe 20 minutes. So the first question is around impact of COVID-19 on credit transfer. And, colleagues wonder whether there have been any major shifts in the concept and approaches.
Not major shifts in the concept of credit that are delivered so far. I think I've talked about the idea that micro-credentials and lifelong learning are gaining as a concept in the UK, and those are developing. And certainly over the course of the pandemic, it became clear that there may well be much more demand, and that providing online education offered much more flexibility for that kind of demand. But actually, in terms of the credit framework, no shift yet. That might come. But I think we have just reviewed the credit framework. And if you go back to the fan diagram that I showed, that is the new framework. And that looks at the possibility of micro-credentials and how they would build up into a sort of larger qualification. In terms of pedagogy, yes, there's been a huge amount of development. There was a massive shift right at the beginning of the pandemic where the UK government said that, universities must close down and students must engage with their learning from a position of lockdown. And so there was a massive pivot to online learning and particularly online assessment. And there was an enormous amount of thinking about how to assess learning online, how when you can't have an exam hall full of students sitting a traditional 3-hour summative written assessment, how do you ensure that they've met their learning outcomes? And that was particularly important for final year students and for students engaged in medical and related subjects where the workforce was clearly very keen to have their new employees as quickly as possible. We did a lot of work with sector bodies and with the government and with professional regulatory bodies to make sure that that could be done without delay so that students were not delayed in their graduation and in their ability to move into employment, that there was no loss of the standards of assessment and of learning. And in fact, what we saw was that assessments became much more creative. People thought much more carefully about what sort of thing was required for a student to demonstrate they had met the learning outcomes. And for the most part, providers, institutions went back to their strategies, to their learning and teaching strategies, and thought about engaging with those and how they could deliver what the students were expecting and required within the framework of their strategies. And that was a really stressful but dynamic and creative process. And I think universities really rose to the challenge and delivered very strongly. I don't know whether you would want to come in on that, Alison.
Just very briefly, I think what we learned was, A, how quickly the sector could adapt under pressure, and we did very well. If we look at the outcomes, we still were getting quality outcomes in terms of students graduating. The most important thing to reflect upon, though, was the student experience of going online. And we at Advanced HE, we run an annual student academic experience survey. And for the first time, we noticed a dip in terms of student satisfaction, the experience of the course. And there was a very strong message. Don't think you can put everything online, because the in-person experience on campus was absolutely integral, not just to their social life, but to their learning and their well-being. It's the learning that happens in the cafe. It's the learning that happens sat under a tree in the sunshine discussing issues. And whilst there were considerable benefits for a whole range of groups that Vicky's already talked about, carers, disabled staff, disabled people. There's a very clear message that we getting the balance of pedagogy right between what works better online, but how do we get students back on campus? Having said that, universities in the UK are now having a bit of a struggle to get students, particularly in London, back to campus because they don't want all the travelling when they could. So it's interesting. It's a constantly evolving thing. But I think the importance of surveying your students to understand their needs and getting that feedback is absolutely critical. Thank you.
Thank you. And there is a little question between my three questions, and that is from Alexandra, who says, what is the difference between typical and ECTS credits?
It's a very good question, and that again goes back to the fan diagram in my presentation, and we will let you have the slides so you can share those out to people, Jamilia, and they can look over them in their own time. But basically, 360 typical credits in the UK are equivalent to 180 European credit points. So it's a 50% mapping, but the really important caveat is that the learning outcomes must be consistent. So it's not simply about credits, it's also about course design and the standards that are set in those learning outcomes. So basically 360 credits for a full degree in the UK, a full bachelor's degree, 180 credits for a full bachelor's degree in the European credit transfer system. 2 UK credits are equivalent to 1 European credit, but there is that overriding requirement for the outcomes to be the same.
Thank you very much. Yes, and Alexandra and everyone else, we will be sharing the slides and the recording of this presentation. So my second question was around just probably one challenge that universities have faced at a national level in developing credit transfers in the UK.
Just one.
Just one from each of you.
Okay, so I mean, one challenge that universities have faced around the UK is that, of course, the UK is not one nation, it's 4 nations. And the policy environment in each of those 4 nations is slightly different. And education is one of the devolved elements of government. So each government has a different approach to education. And I guess this is most obvious to see between England and Scotland, where there is a completely different education system in those 2 countries. So the challenge there was to create a credit system that would work equally in 4 different environments with 4 different governments and 4 different policy intents. And that is complex, but luckily we're used to working within that complexity. We didn't, as you do, have the luxury of starting from the beginning. We had to start where we found ourselves at the time, and that often makes things even more complicated. But nonetheless, I think the thing that we have found really the key to kind of overcoming any degree of complexity within the education environment is that consultation that Alison referred to, talking to students, being really clear what their expectations are, talking to government, and bringing together communities of practice between universities to think how they can best work together to deliver the quality of education that's required, and to preserve the reputation of the national offering, and to deliver the kind of the things that you're trying to do. So really it is a question of co-creating, collaborating, and working across the whole range of stakeholders to make sure that you have something that works in each of the environments you're trying to apply it.
Thanks, Vicky. Alison?
Okay. I would have said I would have chosen the same 4 different nations. That's quite a challenge, and I think that's interesting because you may well be feeling similarly in Uzbekistan. How do we bring all these different regional institutions? How do we choose where we're going to, which framework we're going to align with? It's really about working through that consensus together. So I'm conscious of time, but thank you for the invitation.
Thank
Any
you.
more questions?
Yeah, and maybe a final question, and that is around professional development for academic leaders. As you have heard from the Ministry of Higher and Secondary Specialised Education, Yurt Umidi Foundation, you know, if you talk to universities, we know there are so many new opportunities for professional development created for academic leaders, for teachers in higher education. When it comes to credit transfer, can you advise on the best opportunities that exist in the UK for academic leaders in this sphere?
Shall I start here, Vicky? Again, I mean, this is incredibly important, and I would say in the last 2 decades, the UK have particularly invested as a sector, and particularly in the early days with government funding and support, to develop and enhance academic leadership capability, not just academic, because a university is a microcosm, you know, of the system it serves. It's also the support, administrative, professional, technical staff in terms of leading, and never is it more important than when you're given autonomy. So I started in the sector 30 years ago. I should be embarrassed to say, but when I started, we were a polytechnic and we were given autonomy. And my vice chancellor, who was an accountant, was very worried about the money, but he was also worried about the capability of leaders to lead. So we started this journey a long time ago. And again, there are a variety of ways of developing leadership capabilities. Some people might do an MBA, some people might go off to Harvard for a week. What we did as a country, though, was invest very heavily in developing higher education specific through our national agency, which is now Advanced HE, programs, courses, which are particularly focused on the issues for academic leadership. This is culminating now in us we're currently running a global survey on what is effective leadership for higher education. And that will give rise to a global leadership framework, very similar to our teaching fellowship framework, which will allow people to earn micro accreditations and build up not just their skills and experience, but also the evidence base about leading in higher education. So I would say, as somebody who used to run this in a university, my focus was developing leadership capability within your university, because that will help you change the culture. Then I would like to look to a national program or scheme where my leaders and managers would learn from others. And the really good value in that is, when you're doing leadership training in your institution and you float ideas, academics are very analytical and they can find reasons why things won't work. But when they go and sit with somebody from, you know, the University of Tashkent, Samarkand, Westminster, and they're all learning together, when they say, well, that doesn't work, Samarkand says, well, we actually do it in our university, so it is working here. And you get that cross-institutional challenge, which really begins to shift the dial in terms of leadership. So we use a combination, but I think the 20 years investment that we have made nationally in leadership has transformed our approaches. I'd love to talk more about this at some stage because it really is my passion, but it's multifaceted. I think, you know, master's degrees are helpful, but the extent to which they change the culture or really change behaviour, it is not the same as really focused work, which also can lead to the development of the whole organisation. It's a combination of individual, group and team and whole system development. So it has a place, but it's not the only way.
Thanks, Alison. And Vicky?
I'm not sure I have much to add to what Alison's already said. She's very much the expert in this field. But I think, you know, for me, it always comes back to that kind of collaboration and co-creation, which works best across the piece. So thinking about Alison's example of getting leadership together from different providers, different universities, you know, even globally in environments where you wouldn't think necessarily there are the same policies or difficulties, challenges to solve. But that kind of thinking together in a sort of action learning set type environment, co-creating, collaborating is an extraordinarily productive way, I think, of growing leadership and developing ideas.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, both Alison and Vicky. I think this has been a really, really interesting discussion. You can see it from the comments in the chat. So, and it's timely. You know, it's the time when all universities are reviewing their policies, reviewing their strategies, started working internationally, and you know, and it's the whole process which is so important. And I think what you were giving as examples, you know, all of it, peer reviews, peer support, you know, collaborative working, it all is part of the process that contributes to quality of education. We have started consultations with universities and our partners around next themes for our discussions. And interestingly, Alison and Vicky, leadership is one of the themes, leadership in higher education, so that people are empowered and informed about new ways to lead higher education sector confidently and effectively. And the other theme that colleagues are proposing is how to ensure that higher education sector is really responsive to the needs of rapidly changing labor market, both nationally and internationally. But I'm sure there will be other themes for our discussions, and we will be very happy to discuss with our partners in Uzbekistan and UK, and then we will plan our policy discussions accordingly. And now I would like to thank everyone for this interesting discussion, to all participants of this webinar today. We will share the recording, we will share the slides, and please send us your questions through various project channels, and we will be very, very happy to respond to them in our further discussions. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening or afternoon.
Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.